I said, you're not moving to London, you're moving to 19th century Russia, basically. It's a new form of serfdom. I don't think Gary Stevenson shops enough. He's only got one mug. I keep watching his podcast. Gary, buy a second mug, help the economy out a bit, right? But I think we fundamentally have to hear him out. We've got to get back into the office because we need to bail out Pret-a-Manger, after COVID. And I said, you're not bailing out Pret-a-Manger, you're bailing out the Duke of Westminster. If your parents own a bloody 6-bedroom house in Beaconsfield, is it actually worth getting a graduate job? 50% of your NHS cashback, I think, happens in the week preceding your own death.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I am Callum Price, Director of Communications here, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Rory Sutherland. Rory is the Vice Chairman of the Ogilvy Group. He is a British advertising executive and writes the fantastic Wikiman column in The Spectator, as well as multiple other books, columns, and you're these days, a prolific social media commentator as well. As
by accident.
Anybody who spent any time on TikTok will attest. I would
Who would have guessed? This is, by the way, one of the things which is the value of markets.
Go on.
Okay, which is they can discover things which don't make sense in advance. No one would have. I ended up famous on TikTok because a young, very talented film student just started taking clips of my talks and TikTokizing them. And the first thing I knew about it was effectively when I'd occasionally get mobbed by school kids. Now, no one would have said, 59-year-old portly bloke, right? Natural TikTok person. And the fact that actually markets are a discovery mechanism where you discover product, services, goods for which no one could have made the case in advance, that only their popularity effectively, their only justification is their own popularity in existence. It's a very Darwinian thing.
Yeah.
Just as actually evolution produces life forms that you wouldn't have designed with a pencil and pad. Okay, that's one of the most magnificent things about it. I mean, as I said, tried to get Red Bull through the Soviet system. No, I assure you, comrades, I know it tastes disgusting, but it's going to be a really big thing. Would have been impossible. And the fact that you don't necessarily need to win an argument before you can try out an idea is a fundamental value of effectively markets as discovery. I don't really believe markets are efficient, by the way. I think they're a great discovery mechanism. Sod that efficiency crap, all that fucking shareholder value bollocks. Absolute nonsense, okay? It's not, competition ensures a certain degree of efficiency and, I buy all that. But that's not, as I said, loving capitalism because it's efficient is like loving Bob Dylan because he's got a beautiful singing voice. It's to hold a healthy opinion, but for a ridiculous reason. Okay. And I think that's really, really important, by the way, because if you had asked someone like Herbert Simon, what is the purpose of a business? Currently, the official purpose of a business is to serve the shareholder interests and to put the shareholders first. Herbert Simon would say, no, profit is not an objective, it's a constraint. You have to make a profit in order to stay in existence. But the purpose of an organization is to discover new forms of value. It's actually a discovery mechanism, it's an exploratory mechanism for discovering ways in which resources that are available to that entity can be put to the use of other people, brackets, profitably. And if we adopted that approach, that kind of paradigm for business, we'd all be a lot richer, including the shareholders, ironically.
So do you think profit is getting in the way here? I
think the narrow-minded pursuit of short-term profit in the interests of what must be only a narrow group of share owners or shareholders, and in any case, is a fundamentally bad proxy for the value of a company. And I think increasingly, I think the investor community realizes this, but essentially the need for comparison between different entities drives this idea that you have to have a single goal. I would argue what's really interesting about a business is, in fact, that it triangulates the interest of four, actually, at least, four different stakeholders, which include the employees themselves, the customers of the business, who probably, if anybody should be paramount, it's them because they actually give you money, the investors, and you would hope wider society. I don't think you can neglect. I know you're pretty kind of free market, but I don't think you can neglect externalities. I don't think you can neglect public opinion. I think that a good business should earn at least the respect of people who aren't its customers. But no, the interesting thing is the triangulation, the creative resolution of what appear initially to be conflicting interests into something which benefits all three. That's the magic of a business, not the fact that it can simply, cut costs, replace people with technology, and enjoy a short, often illusory fillip in its profits. And by the way, I mean, I would argue that it's very difficult to compare. I would argue that as value creation mechanisms, family-owned companies and privately owned companies or founder-led companies are probably better value creation entities than PLCs. Why? First of all, they're focused on their customers and their staff, not because they don't have shareholders to distract them with, ludicrous kind of, proxy measures. They don't have to. Secondly, because customers and employees live in the real world. This is a Dan Davis point. If you're a marketing-led organization focused on your customers, you are focused on real life in some shape or form with all its complexities and all the changes. If you are pursuing profit as a measure, it's effectively a completely artificial construct. By the way, to a completely artificial timescale. What profit you're pursuing profit under what timescale? If you're a pharmaceutical research entity, you can't say, well, if we don't come up with a blockbuster drug that next month, you're all fired. Okay. And so, the shareholder value movement, apart from anything else, seems very clear, but it's actually incoherent if you dig a bit deeper.
And do you think that interpretation of value that we often adhere to causes problems as well? I often think about this when you think about companies like Amazon, for example, who get a bad time in the realm of public opinion because they don't pay the taxes, or they don't necessarily treat their workers too well. Lots of those stories gain a lot of traction.
They treat their customers extremely well.
Well, exactly.
People have to admit,
people sort of forget how great life is that we can get things delivered that much stuff delivered that quickly. That
the interesting question is if you take a competitor in the sense of Amazon's, which is Costco. Costco treats its workers unbelievably well and pays them insanely generously by the standards of the business. And what you might argue is that people perhaps tacitly value service, quality, happy employees for all kinds of anthropological reasons that they're not even aware of themselves. I'll give you a lovely reframing of this, which is the family business, the privately held business versus the PLC. Most PLCs look at their call center. Now, the call center is dealing with existing customers and has an extraordinary opportunity. I would argue that in a sensibly run business, it should be possible for someone working in a call center to earn six figures quite easily. I don't just mean, at some high financial level. I mean that the value you can have by engineering great customer experiences, by being very good at that job, can increase the lifetime value of customers really substantially. Reduced defection.
Yeah.
In other words, if you're investing in the relationship rather than just the immediate transaction, you do things differently. Most PLCs would look at the call center as something they're desperate to automate because it has quite a large wage bill. They wouldn't look at it as a source of value creation because their model of value comes from economics. Well, it comes from non-Austrian economics. They believe that value is created in the factory. I would argue that value is created in the brain. I would, as an advertising person. Obviously, there's a degree of self-interest there. But in fairness, a lot of your Austrian heroes like von Mises and so forth and Hayek would have accepted the fact that the only acceptable definition of value is that someone is willing to pay for something. And therefore, optimizing for operational efficiency without optimizing for customer experience, say. In other words, yes, this product is very cheap, but the people selling it to me are arseholes. All right, is fundamentally bad business, even though it looks great on a spreadsheet. Now, here's the contrast. So the PLCs are all saying, let's try and slim down the call center. Most call center staff are probably metriced on how quickly they can bring a call to an end. That's oversimplified, but broadly speaking, it's looked at as an efficiency problem. It's not looked at as an opportunity. If you contrast that, I spoke yesterday to someone who'd worked extensively with James Dyson. And James Dyson was sitting in on a presentation about, I don't know if you've ever experienced the Dyson call center.
No.
But it's astoundingly good.
Mm-hmm.
And he was sitting in on this conversation, and they were talking about operational efficiency. And James Dyson said, "You've got this completely wrong. You're looking at this as a nuisance to be solved when someone calls us. I want you to think about this differently. I want you to consider it a great honour that one of our customers wants to get in touch with us. And we should therefore respond accordingly. In other words, we should be flattered and delighted that one of our customers wants to contact us for whatever reason. And we should see this as an opportunity to do something remarkable rather than what you might call, a nuisance cost to be minimised."
But that would only in your critique of the Austrian school, that would only translate into value in that vision if, therefore, people were willing to spend more money on those services that had better customer services.
My father, who's remarkably stingy in many ways, my late father, owned something like 3 Dyson devices. He had one upstairs, one downstairs to save him carrying it up. Now, they're expensive.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody logical would have seen a market for those things, except among the relatively wealthy, and yet not true. He's discovered something which didn't really make sense in advance, that the market for high-quality products of some kind, as indeed Steve Jobs discovered, you could say he's kind of like, the Steve Jobs of, things that blow, is actually the appetite for quality, even among people who are quite cash constrained, and for very rational reasons, which is when you're cash constrained, you can't afford to buy something that's rubbish, is surprisingly high.
Yeah.
And I'll give another example. They do offer very low prices, not insanely low, but very low prices. Most of Octopus Energy's advertising is focused on the quality of their customer service. Now, I think that has been massively undervalued, and I'll give you a reason why. I think the human brain will tend, and I shouldn't say this as an advertising person, but they will tend to prioritize a human experience with a brand over an artificial experience with a brand. So, in the advertising industry, you might spend ages agonizing about the tone of voice of an email, and quite correctly, because you're sending them to thousands and thousands of people. But generally, well, I'll tell you a very interesting story. Most estate agents are terrified of the buyer meeting the vendor before something's been signed. Because if you don't like the person who's selling the house, you won't buy the house. Humans are so personal. Now, if you think about it, the person who's selling the house is utterly irrelevant because they're moving away. If they were moving next door, yes, it's perfectly reasonable to say, I don't want to buy this house because the guy next door is going to be an arsehole. But this person's probably moving 5 miles away. And yet, people are so strongly driven by instincts of who to trust, who to like, who can be an ally, who's an opponent, that the personal trumps almost everything else. And we need to be alert to this because we're trying to create a world that's increasingly automated. And yet, let me put this quite simply. If my late mother, who's a brilliant psychologist in a way, she wasn't a professional psychologist, but she had a brilliant instinct for human nature. If she were buying a second-hand car, she would make almost all her judgments about the car from her judgments of the personality of the person selling it. In other words, can I trust this person? Are they the kind of person who'd get the car serviced? Are they the kind of person who'd sell me a car knowing that it was a stinker? And an AA mechanic would ignore the person, or if you're buying the car at auction, you would merely look at the car and its mechanical components. My bet would be that I think my mother would buy fewer clunkers than the AA mechanic would, because you can game the system. It's easier to game the system in terms of mechanical components than it is to game the system in terms of very, very highly evolved instincts into personality and trustworthiness. And I'll tell you a lovely story about this, about how important the personal is. Wonderful guy called Alex Batchelor was the marketing director of Royal Mail. And they were completely bemused, Royal Mail, because there appeared to be no correlation between the service level that Royal Mail offered in any given postcode area and the brand reputation that Royal Mail enjoyed. But they thought, this is a bit strange. We're sweating like crazy to have 98 98.7% first-class mail delivered next day, etc. And yet nobody seems to care. It seems to be something. And eventually they dug into it and discovered by far and away the biggest driver of your attitude to Royal Mail as an organisation was whether you liked your postman. And I think that's still true of human beings. Now, I had a very weird experience on Sunday, a couple of Sundays ago. Right? I think Southern Water are a brilliant company. Okay, well, now, I don't read the Financial Times, okay? I have no idea. They might be massively indebted. They might be ripping me off. But my wife was walking down the street in Walmer, and there was a massive pipe burst with like a fountain coming out of the street. So my wife says, look, you're online at home. Can you just go and find the Southern Water emergency number and phone up and report this? And she gave a kind of location. And I eventually found the number and I rang up, and the person on the phone, who is ironically Northern, you'd think some, but anyway, maybe if you ring Northern Water, you get someone from Cheltenham. I don't know how it works. Was utterly delightful, incredibly helpful, very grateful, pointed out that it had been prioritised to top priority, and actually I was the second person to have reported it, and someone will be there within an hour and a half, and was utterly fantastic. On a Sunday, I wasn't really totally expecting to answer the phone, and that's what someone... there's a particular marketing entity in the US, yes, I can't remember, they call that a brand quake. In other words, it's a kind of tectonic plate movement in your impression of an organisation. And it's much easier to create a brand quake, I think, person to person, than it is medium to person. And so one of the things I'd say about nearly all PLC organisations, in fact, nearly all marketing organisations, is I would confidently say, without knowing anything else about them, that with a few exceptions, perhaps Dyson would be one, that everybody is over-invested in customer acquisition and under-invested in customer service and customer retention. And this has been driven by a cost-saving mentality that understands cost but doesn't understand psychological value, where effectively, as I said, people look at the service of a customer not as an opportunity to create lifetime value and to invest in an ever-deepening, more trusting relationship. They see it as a cost to be minimized to a point where, and this is, I've been using the internet since actually before there was a web, since the late 80s. I've been using the internet. Quite nerdy claim there, in fact. I was on news groups back in the late 80s. And I love the internet. I'm quite good at using it, but I'm getting increasingly sick of the extent to which organizations think they can outsource work to their own customers. The bureaucracy they used to take care of themselves, the form filling, the filling in your name, that, can we have some more details for money laundering legislation purposes? Now, part of that's not their own fault entirely, because government has just basically subsumed these people in unnecessary bureaucracy and regulation, which means that every single major financial transaction involves signing something at the bottom of a 10,000-word document that no one can read and no one's ever going to read, but it's done effectively for arse-covering reasons. But as a consequence of that, but also as a consequence of their own cost-cutting urges, what they're doing is they're outsourcing work to their own customers. And one of the things I noticed, it's pretty easy to buy something from Amazon. I bought a car a week ago. I would say that if you're buying a car, you're planning to get some financing on the car, you better take a week off work just to complete the paperwork, send in photographs of your driving license, get approval for this. What was it we had to do? We had to sign something. We ended up going into Ryman's in Abergavenny anyway, because we had to print something out and scan it or something like that. If you want to buy a house, if you want to move house, I would argue that for a couple, probably now that will involve them in about 10 days' work, literally, maybe even more.
Yeah, takes ages.
Simply dealing with the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Now, we can streamline that a bit, I think, but actually at some level, we shouldn't forget that's what companies used to do for their customers. And now what they're doing is effectively making their customers work for them. And it looks wonderful from the point of view of price comparison. I don't think it's all that great from the point of value creation, and it's an extraordinary waste of people's time.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, just to take a step back soon, do you think that capitalism and free markets have a branding problem?
Yeah. As I said, if you view them as a discovery mechanism rather than and actually they have a branding problem with their own workers, because Capital's, to quote Scott Galloway, Capital's been kicking the shit out of Labour for the last 20 years. I mean, there have been some unbelievably stupid decisions made in the decision that 50% of people must go to university. Was based on the fact that when 10% of people went to university, they enjoyed a premium in the marketplace. Surprise, surprise, when 50% of people go to university, a university degree, even if it's a first-class degree, doesn't have the market value that it did when it was comparatively scarce. And but nonetheless, I think that I think a lot of this falls into the field of narrative economics, which is that companies have managed, particularly in the absence of trade unions or any other countervailing force, they've managed to get everybody to believe the narrative that people are infinitely fungible and replaceable, and that experience isn't particularly valuable because work is now being reduced into, a series of separate tailorist processes. So, and that tacit knowledge, for example, or experience is of no particular value. All you need is a qualification. And in fact, that whole kind of credentialism in employment has served to make people effectively, it's resulted in people being paid less, because the experience isn't valued, the qualifications are, but the qualifications are now no longer scarce.
Mm-hmm. So how do you look? We're at the Institute of Economic Affairs. We believe that markets is the solution to society's problems on the whole, that capitalism can deliver for people.
They will be reasonably well regulated. I used to hold to that thing, but well regulated. I mean, even Adam Smith qualifies it.
Yeah,
tolerable administration of justice.
There are some allowed capitalists in the building, but not most of us.
No. I also think let's get Gary Stevenson back on, because I think we have to hear him out, because I think to a large extent he's right, that more and more, I don't care where wealth goes if it goes into productive, exploratory and inventive activities. I do care that two or three of the biggest landowners in the United States are Bill Gates, I think, Ted Turner, I don't know if it's Zuckerberg, but they're tech bros are buying up huge swathes of agricultural land. Bezos, I think, is a massive landowner. Now, hold on. If you're that ingenious, but the best use you can think of your money is to buy land, there's something wrong with land, isn't there? Which is that nobody's making it anymore. It's that famous, I think it might have been Harpo Marx or somebody. Whatever you do, if you've got money, buy land, because they're not making it anymore, except in Holland to a limited extent. And what you're doing now, if you buy a buy-to-let property in London, is not the same as what you were doing in 1987. And this is one of the problems, I think, which is that what happens in economics is people see a desirable trend, like more people going to university, and assume that you can extrapolate it indefinitely without something different happening. Now, my father was a landlord. We lived in a big Victorian house in the Welsh borders, and it was split into 6 sort of apartment/flats/houselets. And we lived in the biggest one and had most of the use of the garden, but not exclusive use of all the garden. And in the time I was kind of teenage, going through the 70s and 80s, we must have had 40 or 50 tenants come and go, maybe a little less. Most of those people at that location at that time could have bought a house if they'd wanted to, but they were choosing to rent. Mm-hmm. If you own a house in London now, most of the people who are renting from you have no choice but to rent. That's different. You started out being a landlord and you were giving people optionality. Now you're basically imposing an obligation. What you are doing by buying property in London is buying the right to tax the younger generation. And in fact, we wonder about, why young people are quite left wing. Well, they do get something out of their taxes. I think young people get massively less out of their taxes than old people do, but part of that one. I think we have a government and a tax policy that's largely gerontophile, in that it shovels money towards the old in every respect it can find, if you think about it, the young, wonderful supporters of the NHS, they get absolutely bugger all back from their money.
Yep.
Right? I mean, actually, I think you get 50% of your cash back. I shouldn't call it cash back. 50% of your NHS cash back, I think, happens in the week preceding your own death. Okay? Now, that's a massive weighting of taking from the young and the poor and giving to the old and often rich.
Yeah.
You have the triple log. And they vote. Old people vote. You have, I would argue probably, I'm not sure what my view is on inheritance tax. I don't know that pension contributions should be entirely tax-free to the extent they are, because let's face it, saving is at one level a very noble and healthy endeavour. But let's be honest, if you are saving money, it's money you don't need right now. And so what I would say is that I said to my daughter, "You're not moving to London." When she started renting a flat in London, I suppose what I should do is give them the deposit, but then I'm just contributing to the problem. Well, I said, "You're not moving to London. You're moving to 19th century Russia, basically. It's a new form of serfdom, and of her pre-tax income, 50% goes on rent."
But the problem there that we would argue,
but all economists think that rent seeking is bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
You all think it's a bad thing, but I've never heard a single economist go, "We need to clamp down on this rent-seeking business." It's the most inconsistent load of bollocks in the whole field of economics. Adam Smith was absolutely clear about this.
The thing that we've been saying since the mid-1980s is that the problem with the housing system is that we've effectively banned house building.
That's one part of the problem.
It's a massive part of the problem, isn't it?
No. I mean, there are about five things. There are very, very few headwinds to rising property prices, and there are about 10 tailwinds, one of which is government indulgence of capital gains. Second thing is banks can lend much more, and we had a period of artificially low interest rates caused by the financial crisis. Third thing is undoubtedly it is difficult to build and indeed to innovate in the property sector. I would be in favour of micro-housing. It's illegal to build it.
Exactly, yeah.
Right, which is bonkers.
Yeah.
For all kinds of reasons. In fact, I think a lot of Londoners with larger homes would move out if they could keep a micro-house in London.
Definitely.
Okay, the fact that you can't build properties below a certain size, the fact there are a load of bollocks constraints on what you can build, I mean, other than aesthetics, the fact that the planning system is a living nightmare. There are also narrative and psychological factors. Property is one of those areas, along with, I would argue, perhaps education, healthcare, second wives, where people don't look at the opportunity cost. They have a basic mentality, which is, I'll get to the deposit, I'll find out the most I can possibly borrow, and I will then add those two sums together and I will buy a house that costs about that amount. Now, if we bought cars that way, we'd all be driving around in a Bugatti Veyron, right? Well, not all of us, but I mean, everybody would be driving around in some bling-tastic thing. But because this is the only way in which you can make a sizable bet on an asset class by borrowing money. If I went to the bank and said, I'd like to borrow £400,000 to invest in Tesla shares, they'd tell me to piss off. If I go and say I want to borrow £400,000 to go buy a house, they go, sign here. So there are about 9 different factors, some of them psychological, some of them that we have a generation of people who've only known property going up. Some of them are the fact that they know effectively that no government can take on property ownership and can claim capital gains on your primary residential property because it would never get elected again by all these oldsters. There are about 10 factors. The factors that are, but the absence of people considering the opportunity cost strikes me as genuinely bizarre in that you have people. Oh, the other one is that oldsters don't move out. They don't downsize. Now, one of the things I'd instigate pretty quickly is to say, if you move from your primary residence to a smaller, cheaper residence between the ages of about 65 and 72, you don't pay stamp duty when you sell your house. In other words, you get 2 lots of stamp duty exemption. And then that creates an impetus for people to get the fuck out. Now, I know this because I've seen data that shows that if you don't downsize voluntarily before the age of 72, you will only do it under financial or health duress. Now, I would argue we need to accelerate that. Now, in a way, it's quite rational because you go, let's say you're 78 and you're in a fuck-off house. You go, well, I could move now. I would then pay a load of stamp duty. And I could end up only having to move again into a care home in 2 years' time because I'm 78. I don't have enough confident expectation of remaining lifespan to downsize. So I think you need a mechanism to accelerate it. My brother lives in a street in Buckinghamshire entirely full of 4 and 5 bedroom homes. They're the only person in that street with a kid.
Yeah. I mean,
this is nuts.
Now,
one of the weird things is that people also become weirdly paranoid. So I think a lot of people are frightened of leaving London because the terror is that once you leave, you'll never be able to go back.
Yep.
And but one of the things I would support, one of many things, I mean, I'd support flexible working as a form of escape from the depredations of the landlord. I would support paying for high speed 2 by land value capture at 2 or 3 stations along the line where you could build new towns which would pay for the entire railway. And so high speed 2 could not only solve the transport problem, it could actually solve the housing crisis in part because you'd build sort of 30, 40,000 pound communities, which are de facto 20 minutes from Euston. That means they're St Albans, effectively. That's really valuable land. Agricultural land, 3,000 quid. Now with a railway, 20 minutes from Euston and planning permission, it's worth about £1.5 million an acre, not 2,000 or 3,000 an acre. Consequently, whoop-de-doo, you just paid for your railway. Do that 3 times, you've paid for your railway. I'd support loads and loads of things, but I'd support massive disruption. I'd support land value taxes. But the point is that it is effectively, it's a bubble with a problem. Because if you had a Dutch tulip bubble, you get bubbles in art. You get bubbles in forms of furniture. Doesn't really bother me because those things are substitutable. Okay. If we had another Dutch tulip bubble, I could substitute with lupins or gladioli. Okay, I'm not absolutely dependent on the tulip. You know, nobody ever said, "Look, son, you really need to take a bit of that money and get on the tulip ladder." But with property, it's both. Well, it's everything. It's a Veblen good. It's an investment vehicle. You look at all those apartments on the South Bank near Battersea Power Station. You don't see a fucking light on, do you? It's some bloody overseas person owning it as what they call in New York, it's a safety deposit box in the sky. It's bullshit. You know, we've allowed this to happen.
Yeah, and it's a lot of it. We would argue political choice as well. So on the political choice point,
by the way, I'm an advertising guy, and I support some degree of redistribution of wealth on the simple grounds that if you give money to poor people, they actually spend it on things that benefit the economy. If you give money to rich people, they save it. Now, if they're saving things in investing, if you're Elon, where you live in a tiny house, but you're building a rocket ship, okay. You know, because that is actually productive in it's innovative. He does actually live, I think he lives in his own tiny house, doesn't he? I think.
I don't know.
I've got a vague idea. But if, on the other hand, you're taking... Now, what you will find in the economy is, this is US data, apologies, the poorest or the lowest earning 20% of the population, quintile, I think it's called, isn't it, earn X. The highest earning quintile earn 14 times as much, but they only spend 4 times as much on consumption. The rest will typically now, look, if it goes into their pension, fine, great. You know, you want to defer expenditure. If it goes into basically propping up a property bubble, which is unsustainable, is a massive drag on the productive economy. Massive drag on, I would argue, a massive drag on motivation, by the way. You know, one thing that matters about capitalism is people will work harder and try and earn more if they have something to aspire to. And I was underspent on property because I'm basically extremely vulgar and I like a bit of bling. If you give me a bit of spare cash, my wife would go, "Oh, let's go buy a bigger house." I go, "Fuck that hot tub." My tastes are fundamentally nouveau riche. You know what
I'm right with you.
You know what I mean? But actually, let's look at the opportunity cost here, which is, think of what you could do with the £140,000 you're paying for an extra bedroom that you hardly use. What I think is going on there is the extra bedroom is a tax-efficient investment vehicle. It's not utility in the conventional economic sense. And you keep getting these old people who literally or they're sitting in a £2 million house and they're shopping at Lidl and they're worried about the price of lemons.
Yeah.
Well, when I was young, if someone said one day you're going to be a millionaire, but you're really going to be worried about lemons, I go, yeah, it's bollocks. So a millionaire, flash motor, all that sort of stuff. But now it's become, I think, absolutely poison. Now, to our grandparents' generation, they'd look at us and they go, you've got all these amazing consumer goods. Looking at television is fantastic. You've been to America. That's incredible.
You can eat at a restaurant.
Look at your car.
Easily.
You eat out in a restaurant casually. Everything that consumer capitalism has provided has got not necessarily better, but it's got more accessible. Sometimes it's got cheaper. Sometimes it's got better. Sometimes it's got both. By the way, air travel was never as exotic in the 50s as people pretend, by the way. It's a bit of a myth. The idea that it was all wonderful. And it was insanely expensive.
Of course.
All of that stuff you suddenly have access to, and people are going, no, I think I'll buy a sort of 2-bedroom flat in Fulham. Now, my grandparents would go, look, I don't understand. You have all these wondrous things. Why do you live in such a crap house? But all those things cost almost nothing, and the crappy flat in Fulham cost 900,000 quid. What's going on there? There's whack.
The problem is...
Proper whack. Because they're a hot tub. Seriously,
I agree. The solutions to these problems, though, are politically difficult, and it falls into the building 3 new towns along HS2 would be
just the VAT on property, and we had no VAT on goods. That would actually even think. I don't think there should be VAT on pubs. I don't think pubs should pay VAT. They're a public service.
I'll sign up to that.
But actually, why? Okay, look at this. Look at this tax system. Everybody goes fucking bananas if you suggest they should pay inheritance tax. I'm all in favour of inheritance tax because when I pay it, I'm dead, so I'm not that bothered. Now, I've got kids, and I want to give them a reasonable start in life, but the main reason I'm worried about inheritance tax is so that my kids can have a fucking deposit on a house because houses are too fucking expensive. So it's become entire... This is what this wonderful woman called Eliza Furby. Have you read her book, The Inheritocracy? Brilliant, brilliant book. What we're doing is we're creating a kind of property-based caste system, which is when your parents bought a house and where they happen to live in 1973 basically determines the wealth of future generations. It's a racket. That's not meritocratic. So here's the weird thing. And the Labour Party are just as guilty of this bollocks, because they used to say if there was a cut in income tax, they say, it's tax cuts for millionaires. No. Wealth and income used to be sort of the same thing because you were taxed generously enough and property was inexpensive enough that if you earned a good salary, you did become rich. I think that correlation has been completely broken. I wonder why people buy, if your parents own a bloody 6-bedroom house in Beaconsfield, is it actually worth getting a graduate job? Because what you can earn after tax and rent is almost irrelevant compared to the weird tax-free accumulation of the value of your parents' home. So I'm sorry, I don't think Gary Stevenson shops enough. He's only got 1 mug. I keep watching his podcast. Gary, buy a second mug, help the economy out a bit, right? But I think we fundamentally have to hear him out because I don't think, I think it's a very, very valuable counter insight into how the economy is now working. Now, this is worse in London. I would argue there are parts of the country where the property market probably just about still serves a purpose. We don't have migration to the same volume in certain parts of the country. You don't have the stranglehold over building. One thing you could do, by the way, very simply, is you could completely rip up, because this is very IEA here. The Japanese do planning permission in a completely different way. Land is zoned, and what is defined for each zone, however, is not what you can build there, but what you can't. So they have certain zones of land. I would argue the Thames Estuary, large swathe of the Thames Estuary, inside the M25. There are swathes of land where basically you can build an abattoir, do anything you like, and then increasingly, bit by bit, the restrictions come in. You can't build an airport, you can't build a this, you can't build a that. But within those constraints, you're basically free to do what you want to do. It's a kind of reverse polarity planning permission system. I would love it if, grand designs ceased to exist as a program because the process of building your own home was so easy that it made very bad television. Yeah, that would be an objective for property policy. Is to, what's the chap called? MacLeod, is he? The chap who turns up on Grand Bride.
Yeah.
And someone gets pregnant and then, then something fails to arrive. And then the bloke comes round for the council and da-dee-da-dee-da. Like, if Grand Designs was actually not a program, it was just a YouTube channel showing people saying, well, we bought this house and we put it there and everything's great. That would be there is something, by the way, which you have to say is a technological failure in property building, in that property by now should be prefabricated. The way in which we build it in situ is Roman. Now, loads of people like Buckminster Fuller, Frank Lloyd Wright to an extent, have been driving down this particular thing. Why can't we bring Fordist efficiency to the... Now, there are upmarket bling-ass German things. You can buy a Huff House, which is sort of pre-assembled. No, sorry, it's ready. What would you call it? Not ready assembled. It's ready built, but you assemble it on site. Right. But most of the parts, you buy it from a catalogue. That kind of thing should be much more possible. I don't know what's going on there, why it's so difficult to do. There are large swathes of land within walking distance of a railway station where I live in Kent, where there's nothing of any particular aesthetic merit to the area, where housing might even improve it. Also, if we had a decent competition for modern, sustainable, efficient housing, which didn't look like a piece of shit, so there were actually established aesthetic norms here. Yeah, I'll be blunt about it. I live in Kent. I spent a lot of time in Kent and Sussex. If you put that wood clinker cladding on a house, there's a limit to how bad it can look. New England is full of buildings like that in the United States. But no, what it needs is a complete... I agree with you that regulation is a massive contributory factor, but I don't think it's the whole problem. The fact that this is the only way you can get a tax-free lottery win in your life, therefore bet big, is partly belongs in the field of narrative economics. But when I say that I don't think people... Do you want a really interesting one about where people have opportunity costs and where they don't? So I was going to start... I think it'd be great fun. A really, really mischievous financial advisory firm, which is totally irresponsible, right? So instead, all financial advisors optimize for savings and retirement. And what I'm saying is, let's do a financial advisory firm which is consumer focused and it optimizes for fun. And I was doing a few calculations. I discovered that if you've got a few kids at private school, and of course there's VAT on private school fees now, if you just take the kid you don't like very much and take them out of private school and send them to a state school, you will literally save 50% of the money and you can lease a brand new Rolls-Royce Spectre electric car with virtually no benefit in kind because it's an electric zero-emission vehicle. Yeah. So with half of the amount people spend to send their child to a private school, you can have a brand new roller. Now, What's interesting about that is what intrigues me about this, I don't think anybody does that calculation. Do you see what I mean? By sending my kid to private school, what else am I missing out on? Because there are certain things like housing and your kids, and your health, which are absolutist. We don't go, actually, it'd be quite a good move, because if you dropped your kid off at a state school in a brand new Spectre, particularly if you had the blacked out windows, all the other kids would assume you're a bit of a badass and they wouldn't give him any grief. But it's very interesting. It always fascinated me, that comparison, because I don't think anybody's thought.
Are they not absolutist because people have sort of done that assessment very quickly and they're like, well, we're obviously going to pay for that because it's that.
Because it's one of the reasons is there are two forms of consumption. If you think about it, there's rivalrous consumption, where if I don't get it, someone else will. And we're highly rivalrous and competitive with our kids. And there's non-rivalrous consumption, which is if I go and buy some Persil washing up liquid or whatever, okay, it doesn't significantly diminish your access to it. In other words, your capacity to wash dishes or wash clothes isn't impacted by my purchase of that thing. And then there's what you might call actually negatively rivalrous consumption, which might be like something like a firework display, where actually every participant is contributing towards a better firework display. A pub, I would argue, is non-rivalrous. The more people who go to the pub at different times and enjoy it, they're in fact funding what is an asset for a community or, for travelling people. And what's weird about the tax system is we don't seem to distinguish between rivalrous competition for scarce goods, tends to lead to rent seeking, rivalrous consumption, of course, for education, which is, if I don't spend the most on my child's education, they are going to be at a disadvantage relative to some other child. And generally, because you were saying that you generally find that in patterns of inflation, goods that are not regulated in non-regulated markets have gone down in price and have got better, whereas everything where there's regulation has got more expensive. That is true, I think, mostly. However, I would argue that it's not the only explanation for this divergence. Obviously, sometimes scarce goods involve a greater element of human labour, service goods, for instance. And that's a thing called Baumol's cost disease, which is quite interesting. You can't achieve the same efficiencies in a restaurant that you can in a factory. Factories can, Elon's factories can basically churn out Teslas, every 15 seconds or whatever it is now. You can't achieve those efficiencies in terms of a very small number of people producing a huge volume of goods. You can't do that in a hotel or a restaurant to the same extent. You get close, I suppose, with, automation and, budget hotels, but you can't completely achieve the same savings. There are lots and lots of factors, but what we are seeing is a complete divergence in terms of where people's money goes. And as people get richer and richer, more and more of their money, I'll exclude pensions and investments, will go on things which are arguably net negative. So this is my kind of Gary Stevenson case. This is a really interesting finding. Again, American data. Just to give younger people an idea of how ridiculous house prices are now compared to, let's say, the 1950s or 60s, where they were too low, probably. My father always believed that one of the reasons why house prices were low in the 50s, 60s and 70s is that things you really, really needed, like a car or a television or whatever, were really expensive. And, I don't know if they still exist. I think they still do exist. Radio rentals. The reason the shop chain Radio Rentals is called Radio Rentals is that in the 50s and 60s, radios, never mind later on televisions, were too expensive to buy outright, or you were too frightened that they'd break because you couldn't afford to replace them, and consequently a very large number of people rented their radio and then subsequently rented their TV. Now, if we go back to the 1950s in the United States, this is an extraordinary finding, and I need to verify it. But if you added up what people had spent on their stuff, car, washing machine, maybe, dishwasher, possibly, dryer, music centre, clothing, furniture. I included the car, didn't I? TV, maybe, radio, etc. The total value of their purchased stuff was typically not unadjacent to the amount they paid for their house. If you look at that now, it would be almost impossible to find someone who had paid as much for the contents of their home as they'd paid for their home, assuming they'd bought their home recently rather than 1970. Tim Harford, I was talking to, said that would mean you had to have goods worth £50,000, roughly speaking, in every room of the average house.
It's quite difficult to get to that level.
I know people in London who have a car which is worth 1/10,000th, pretty much, of the value of their home. Now, just to give a comparison, my grandparents, who are the fourth family in Wales to own a dishwasher,
it's a great brag.
It's a brilliant brag, isn't it? So I know this because they discovered that a dishwasher existed, and they went into Cardiff to buy one. And they were told that they'd sold, it said how many people bought these, and it was the first dishwasher to arrive. Dishmaster from New Zealand, I think, was the brand. There's still one in the Science Museum. And they were told, we've sold two in Cardiff and we've sold one in Swansea or somewhere. That was it. And that was the only place selling them. Now, that cost them, I can't remember whether it was £80 or £120 for that dishwasher. Just to put that in comparison, they bought their house a few years earlier, which was a 5-bedroom house in Krakow, very nice with a large garden, for £4,000. So what you're saying is that 40 dishwashers, let's say, I can't remember, it might be a little more, roughly speaking, 40 dishwashers equal to one house. Now, even if you bought the most expensive Fisher and Paykel dishwasher on the planet, you could only get to £80,000. And that was a nice house, too. Now, one of the reasons why the economy is obviously in trouble is that we've got so good at supplying people with goods and services that they want and need, that once people hit a certain level of wealth, they've got nothing to do with it. So, as I said, the top quintile of American earners only spend 4 times as much as the bottom, even though they earn 14 times as much. So Gary Stevenson's point, which is that when you reach a certain level of wealth, basically, unless you are into real bling like yachts or private jets, pretty much the only thing you can buy is property to an extent. And so what you're doing is, in many cases, not in all cases, you're basically extracting value from future generations. You're buying the right to tax some future citizen. Now, where you have seen great economic growth tends to be where people can escape from the depredations of landowners, which would be the American frontier, invention of the railways, invention of the car, to a degree flexible working. So in America, you couldn't really extract that much value out of land because people could just move 50 miles west and get some land of their own. That's a gross oversimplification of westward migration and doesn't probably suitably commemorate the people whose land was lost in that westward migration. But nonetheless, I would argue to a degree that we've got things backwards. We would look at America in the 50s and say America was rich. America had lots of cars because they were rich. I would argue there's a counterpoint to that, which is maybe America was rich because they had lots of cars. That cars created wealth because they allowed people to escape further afield, further from their place of work, further from shops and other amenities. You know, a lot of it was not necessarily desirable suburbanization on the first degree, but my God, were those houses cheap. They were really, really fucking cheap. So you could buy a bling-ass car outside your house, which was practically worth what you paid for your house. And so if you don't have one of those escape from, there's a YouTuber at the moment who lives in a van in London. He's a bit of a hero, a Georgist hero of mine, because he goes, this is the effort you have to go to avoid paying rent. And I really sympathize with him, because if you were pained by paying rent, and you would argue that, yes, I accept the fact that many, many buy-to-let landlords in many, many parts of the country are actually providing a service or an option to people, but that in large parts of the country, it's now become entirely extractive. I remember saying this when people said, we've got to get back into the office because we need to bail out Pret-a-Manger, after COVID. And I said, you're not bailing out Pret-a-Manger, you're bailing out the Duke of Westminster. Tim Harford did a load of work with a coffee chain called AMT. Where does all the money go at a railway station when you actually buy a coffee? Basically, a little bit of it goes to the barista, a little bit of it goes to the brand owner, the people doing the actual work. Most of it goes to the person who owns the site. In that case, probably Network Rail. Mm. And this is a problem because it means that money is being increasingly extracted out of the productive economy. We have this tax system. So I was saying about, people get unbelievably precious about inheritance tax, unbelievably precious about wealth taxes because you're taxing me twice. Well, when I go out and earn money, you tax me at 40% or 45% or whatever it may be, my incremental money. Then I go out and buy stuff with it. That's another 20% of VAT. If it's booze, I'm paying even more. You're taxing me 3 times. So what I would say a decent economy is doing, which is people going out and doing useful work and being remunerated for that useful work so that they can buy goods and services from other people doing useful work and that the whole money can circulate fairly quickly. That perfectly benign Mandeville process is effectively that Bernard of Mandeville, he was bang on the fucking money, wasn't he? That, have you come across?
I haven't. No.
He was effectively a precursor to Adam Smith, but it is the Parable of the Bees is the thing you need to read, which was a poem which basically explained how economies work, and it's how private vices led to public benefits. Very similar to Adam Smith's idea of individual actors can create something, effectively through no intention of their own. But anyway, they had the Mandeville thing. If you go out to spend your money, that's what an economy should be doing. But we tax income at an absolutely abominably high level, in my opinion, because that is money you've been paid for actually making something happen. And then we tax capital gains at a ludicrously generous level. I mean, it's the balance now of taxation between effectively impoverishing the middle class or destroying at least the lower 80% of the middle class who haven't quite... And then you have this group of people who reach escape velocity, where you have all the money you need. And suddenly, when you reach that level of wealth, suddenly all these weird tax-efficient or tax avoidance mechanisms open up to you. Mm-hmm. So you have this complete inversion where the richer people get, or the more they, or if you earn money in particular ways which enable you to be a shapeshifter. So it's like hedge funds and people, they can pretend it's a capital gain rather than a salary.
Yeah.
Right?
It can move away.
You create this absurd kind of inversion in a tax system where suddenly you reach this escape velocity point where gravity no longer applies. And that, it doesn't make any sense. Because you don't, just from the point of view of consumption, you want, I'll be absolutely candid, I'm a bit of a shit, I'm a bit greedy. I like to earn in the top decile of the population. But equally, I don't want to be surrounded by people who earn 10 times more than me, because the things they buy and the things they fund will be irrelevant and useless to me. So a consumer economy is much more efficient to a degree when there's a degree of wealth parity. Because all those complement, people will go to the same pubs, they'll go to the same restaurants. Now, if I'm richer than somebody else, I might go to the restaurant 8 times a year and they may only go twice, but the restaurant's still doing double duty. If you get a complete bifurcation in wealth, where you get people who are basically minted and people who are skint, it's not only a problem of society, it's also a problem of quality of consumption. Then, in other words, you have a fundamental. Have you ever been shopping in very rich parts of London? There's nothing there you want to buy. I do want to buy a fucking Louis XIV fucking toilet seat or whatever bullshit these people are buying. And so having a reasonable level of at least gradation is a healthy thing.
I want to talk about sort of frontline politics, because a lot of these, I think we agree on much of this, maybe disagreements elsewhere, but in terms of what the solutions are, there are difficulties in delivering them in a democratic system, because the things that you need to do are often very unpopular. And on the planning side, on the regulated side, you're concreting over the green belt.
The fact that there has never been a case where I can remember where government, well, possibly the poll tax, not a great success story, I admit, where government introduced a new tax but reduced another one. Mm-hmm. The fundamental mistake of economics was conflating land and capital. And to treat two things as if they're the same is utter nonsense. No, Adam Smith didn't do that. Just to be clear, I don't think Ricardo did it. It was a weird 19th century sort of convenience, mathematical convenience. They're totally different. Now, if you introduced a land value tax, but you got rid of something, and you very symbolically said, now the extreme view of Georgism is you have a land value tax and nothing else. You have to say that that's more or less how Singapore works, and it seems to work fairly well.
I did all right.
So that there are some proof points. I think Sun Yat-sen in Taiwan was a kind of Georgist, but he'd never got to fully implement it in Taiwan. Weirdly, I don't think there's a wonderful book by a guy called Mike Burt called The Land Trap. Mm-hmm. I really recommend it. He's an economist journalist. It's very, very good. But fundamentally, we're creating a nonsense here because we're and I blame the media for this. We were talking about all the reasons why property is so expensive, and you're quite right to say that regulation is a contributory factor. It's also, I think, dishonest to pretend that migration isn't a contributory factor.
Yep, entirely.
I think that's just intellectually dishonest. Lump of labour fallacy. All this sort of hand waving by economists, where you thought that supply and demand was a fairly fundamental principle of economics, but somehow you let 1 million people into the country, and that has no effect on. God. Yeah, I'm pro-migration, but let's be at least honest about this. I'm emphatically not on the flag shagging side of politics, but I think that's just total act of dishonesty. The idea that it won't have any effect on infrastructure or demand for housing. Well, I mean, even if it's temporary because there's a lag, even if you had a totally unregulated housing market, there would be an effect. And quite a dramatic effect, because when supply and demand become out of kilter, the effects, you'd only have to have small changes in the two variables to have quite pronounced effects. I think, so there are lots of contributory factors, one of which is the news media, who deserve to be shot for their role in this problem, because for 35 years they presented rising house prices as a good news story. Now, it is only good news if you are waiting for your parents to die or you are planning to downsize. For everybody who is either trying to buy a first home or is hoping to upsize from a small starter home to a slightly larger home, rising house prices are not good news, it's bad news. And nobody ever says great news for people with a full petrol tank. Petrol prices have gone up. You are now richer, which, yes, notionally you aren't. But if the price of something you consume goes up, over time, that's not a good news story. And for some reason, totally financially illiterate journalists presented it as a whoop-de-doo, isn't this wonderful? What the hell is that about?
That's all begotten, isn't it, by the fact that it is... Somehow the culture was moved and has moved to a place in which people who own houses see them as an investment vehicle and as a savings account as much as they do, because they could be quite safe in the knowledge that we're not going to build enough houses to have such a supply side boom that the price may go down.
No one can tax me because old people vote.
I want to talk about
effectively you've created, when enough people, that old joke, which is, when you owe the bank £1,000, you've got a problem. When you owe the bank £1 million, the bank's got a problem. There's a similar inversion, which is if you have 5 million people invested in something. What's weird, of course, is the capacity to... If you introduced land value tax and one old biddy were forced to move out of her fuck-off home into something slightly more modest, they'd create a news story about it. So a large part of this policy is driven by the potency of a sob story. By contrast, let's take someone working at a city law firm who's working... Now, I don't like these people, by the way. I'm not saying wouldn't it be great if there were more really well-paid city lawyers. But nonetheless, you take someone who's 27, who's working, let's say, had a modest background, working at a city law firm, earning 90,000 a year. Or when do you hit 45%? Is that 100,000? Is it something?
25, I think.
125. Okay. If you take one of those people, it's impossible to construct a sob story out of the fact that they're paying 40% tax on most of what they earn while working, even if they're working a sort of, 17-hour day.
Yeah.
You can't create a sob story about a young person who's in work. I'm going to be really nasty now. And I did say this to my parents-in-law. My parents-in-law in their 90s or late 80s. I have a bit of sympathy for that generation, and I don't mind indulging them financially. Because, although they did not fight in World War II, they endured the consequences of it with rationing, austerity. My father said, having, born in 1930, so the 50s, the annoying thing about my life is I spent my 20s and 30s in the grimmest period of, of British post-war life. If you look at people who are sort of pensioners now, many of them were born in not 1930. They were born in the 60s.
Great time.
So, there are people in their 70s who went to the Isle of Wight festival. They were wearing Afghan fucking coats and taking drugs. It's not the same. They're not Captain Tom. They're bloody Major Tom. I don't think we should continue to confer quite the same. Not to mention the fact that if you are 85, you've lucked out anyway, because you've managed to survive to 85. You don't have to get up in the morning. Why have you got a triple log?
So,
sorry, I mean, I think we're overindulging the old, but partly for journalistic reasons.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful guy in Ireland who runs this drone delivery company called Manna. And you can order stuff and a drone takes off from a mile or two away, flies it to you at 60 miles an hour. The cost of the delivery is about 15 pence. All electric, lowers the thing onto your landing pad, typically the trampoline in your back garden. The problem he has is a journalistic problem, which is while he's in operation, he's probably helped avoid 15 moped accidents and also the annoyance of having people riding mopeds all over the place, which in London is, let's face it, a royal pain in the arse. However, he knows that one day a can of baked beans is going to land on someone's Pekingese dog and there will be calls for the whole thing to be banned. So we have a lot of cases where I think this is one of the things. I'm totally in favour of free markets when the free market is in pursuit of innovation and value discovery. And I think there are a lot of institutional factors, not least asymmetry of information. In other words, if you do, I actually defend smart motorways. And the reason I think you have to defend smart motorways is that the good they do is invisible. So we're not dealing with a proper cost-benefit analysis. If a smart motorway causes an accident, we blame the smart motorway. If we have a really easy journey with no traffic jams and there are no accidents because of the smart motorway, we don't notice. Yes. So in assessing those things, you have to use far better measurement than journalistic writers are capable of. You have to actually account for the counterfactual, the parallel universe where there wasn't a smart motorway, and we're not doing that. We're not accounting for the parallel universe where 10 people get injured in a moped accident. We're just going, my dog had and this rights culture and this ludicrous overreach of the legal profession, where they used to be in the business of the administration of justice, and they're now principally, I get the impression a large part of the legal system is just the amplification of grievance. And things are now considered worthy of a rights-based or something or other grievance, which 30, 40 years ago was just tough luck. It was, you rolled with the punches. And now we've created this ludicrously sort of hypersensitive legal system where anybody who's the victim of what you might simply call, what you would have called misfortune. Do you want an interesting story? I love this one. My grandfather, who was a doctor in Tredegar, employed someone as general handyman and driver to drive around to see his patients. House calls. Don't get those anymore, do you? And the guy had been in a Welsh regiment, I think, in World War One, in the absolute height of fighting in the trenches. And one story he told my grandfather, which I find always unbelievable. Okay. But it shows how we've changed generationally. They had a slightly overeager officer, probably a lieutenant. They were old lags. The lieutenant was new and a bit overeager. And he was very eager for them to all, get out their trench ladders and go over the top. And so taking a lead, he climbs up the ladder holding his service revolver and gestures, "Come on, men, forward." And at that precise moment, his shoulder is hit by some shrapnel so that his arm, fully clothed, detaches from his body, flies forward 6 feet, still holding the gun, and lands in the mud. Wait for it. Did they demand counselling? Did they demand compensation, compassionate leave? They all burst out laughing. Now, just to be clear, I don't want to live in a world which is so bloody brutal where someone losing an arm is a source of comedic amusement. But on the other hand, I don't think we can function in a world at the other end of the spectrum. I don't think we can function in a world where you can't tell a joke to which someone might hypothetically be, by which someone might hypothetically be offended. Mm. Or you can't make you can't use language in a figurative way. Now, quite a pertinent moment here. I don't think Graham Linehan should have said what he said. Personally, I don't like exhortation. But I think he's totally entitled to say that. Or certainly, what would have happened in the 1950s and what should have happened then is someone from the local cop shop rings him up and goes, look, Graham, look, we're not going to do anything now, but just be a bit careful when you do this because we get a load of people who will demand we take action. His opinion, technically what you've done is actually an incitement. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Okay, have a word, right? But we've become so bureaucratic and legalized that he's met by 5 armed police officers. Now, just to be clear, I'm not denigrating Graham's physical fitness, but he's clearly not a cage fighter, okay? And secondly, since he's just come off a plane, it's fairly likely that he's unarmed. That level of heavy-handedness is simply completely disproportionate. And what's happened is we have this weird binary world where you can do nothing or you can invoke legal authority, but there are all those glorious evolved mechanisms for dispute resolution which humans have, including humour, for instance, or just having a word. There are extraordinary. If you look at normal functioning human societies, there are spectacular kind of implicit, non-formal modes by which people resolve, not least buying someone a pint. Okay? All of those things, which are glorious anthropological gifts to humanity, are being effectively denied to us because the only mechanisms we're allowed to use in solving a problem are economic and legal. Mm. And what has happened is government has been entirely taken over by lawyers and economists. There is no one of any other. There's no creative department in government. There's no marketing department properly. There are a load of press people who obsess about what's in the news, but there's not a marketing department. In other words, you have this extraordinary kind of regulatory capture by 2 peculiarly aspergic disciplines, which are really all about winning arguments, not solving problems. And one of the most important things, it's all a fake kind of pseudoscience. It's let's pretend things are scientific so that they're absolute and there's a single right answer, which is a totally appropriate mode of engagement in physics or engineering or But in problem solving, that kind of I know how to win an argument mindset is absolutely the worst person you can have. Mm. And I don't care if the idea fails so long as nobody proves me wrong.
Yeah, and this has infiltrated. That may not be the right word, but it's seeped into the private sector as well. You've got a good
seeped. You absolutely soaked the private sector to an extent which you wouldn't have believed possible 20 years ago. You would have said generally the private sector is proof against this. However, it is largely driven, not exclusively. There is a large element of HR, procurement, compliance, capture, because those people can lay claim to legality or rules. And a large part of this is driven by ludicrous fear of litigation, which is a product of the UK following in the footsteps of the US, of taking what are personal and private disputes, which could be solved amicably through discussion, and instead turning them into a matter of litigation. And unsurprisingly, lawyers who are paid by the hour are weirdly conniving in this. It's entirely in their interest to pretend that litigation has to be the default mode for dispute resolution.
And you've effectively built up a class of people, lawyers, that you have an interest in it. It is the entire existence of HR departments, of compliance departments, etc.
To elevate their own importance, which they have the free time to do. And so what you have in any modern business is all those entities which were once support functions designed to make the lives easier for the people doing the proper work. Yeah. What would the person who would have been in 1950 a hospital orderly making the doctor's life easier is now like a member of the lanyard class, as Lord Glassman calls it. Yeah, the lanyard class. They're now bossing the doctors around. Now, not all of it's bad. Just let me caveat this, because there were elements in the 1980s and 90s where we made wonderful recourse to anthropological methods in solving problems within companies. In other words, management was much more about anthropology and psychology than it was about process. And sometimes, in fact, not infrequently, the consequences were abominable. I mean, really, really abominable. And extraordinarily unfair, particularly to junior or female employees relative to male employees. I'm not for a second suggesting that I want a reversion. However, what I think we can say is there's been overshoot, which is now there isn't really a distinction made between what a serious offence is and what someone at I can't obviously name individual cases, but someone who goes out to the pub with their colleagues and says something which is slightly dubious, I would argue that has to belong in the private sphere. It should not be a workplace matter. It's none of your fucking business.
Blurring between the sort of professional environments and the private environments, and how that is impacting on this sort of overly legalistic culture. So what then do you think, if you've looked into it at all, of the government's employment rights bill, which is going to, for example, put more liability on businesses for the jokes that people are making in their third-party works?
This is abominable. Look, humour is actually an evolved gift that humans are born with. When I had very young children, as soon as my twin daughters were born, one thing that utterly freaked me out is how quickly they developed wildly sophisticated sets of humour. Generally involved you popping your head over the side of the cot and then disappearing, or then bringing a soft toy and making it do a ridiculous thing. Right? But they could laugh before they could talk. Mm-hmm. This is fundamental, and it's a different mode of communication, which is not to be taken literally because the context determines the meaning. Particularly in British English. British English is a very, very high context language. This is not me speaking, this is linguists speaking. It's much higher context than American English. Comedy is obviously high context. All comedy, high context. But British English is very, very high context, by which I mean what you literally are saying and what you mean are often quite disconnected. Therefore, the ability to prosecute people for something spoken in that way, or indeed something that's just miswritten, is something we should be terrified of. And humour is obviously a special case, because in many cases you are saying the opposite of what you mean. In some cases, by the way, what you are ostensibly doing and what you're achieving may be completely the opposite. An interesting comedian to look at is a guy called Andrew Schulz in the US, whose content is mild. I mean, you could absolutely put it down on a bit of paper and go, that's racist. And yet his audiences are entirely from the ethnic groups of whom he's making fun. And I would argue that it's working in a peculiar kind of inversion of owning the insult, which is a human characteristic, as you'll notice with, and the phrase Tory was owning the insult. There are quite a lot of names which are adopted by people. In other words, there are Welsh people at Welsh rugby games who bring along inflatable sheep and wave them in the crowd. That's owning the insult. And it's probably a mechanism for, societal harmony, that if you can reduce a difference to a joke, then are you exacerbating the problem, as a literal academic would assume, or are you in fact diminishing the problem? Now, all I can say is you don't get any fights breaking out in Andrew Schultz's routines. He does an extraordinary thing, going to Abu Dhabi, where he plays a stadium. And he's taking the piss out of the various. I mean, a lot of the details are completely beyond me about the supposed attributes of people from Abu Dhabi versus Dubai and so on. There's a great line. Where all the people from Dubai have obviously driven up from Dubai to see him in Abu Dhabi, and he makes the joke: anybody here from Dubai? How does it feel to be surrounded by real money? Okay, and all that stuff I see is it's not actually discordant, it's harmonious. Now, in order to appreciate that, you need to understand that we've evolved these various mechanisms for communication. And I'm pretty Gervais on this. I think his point about there's a distinction between what you say, what you do. There's also vital questions of what your real intent is. And if you say punish someone in the bollocks, I wouldn't do that. By the way, I don't think he should have done it. I think, I think it's inappropriate, and I don't agree with him on most of what he says. But on his right not to be met by 5 cops, Admittedly, apparently airport police always travel in groups of 5, and they're always routinely armed. So we should bear in mind the base rate there. But nevertheless, this is ridiculous. This is effectively lawyers and economists, effectively, a kind of weird cabal of people. I'd also put management consultants in the same frame of people who are effectively trying to reduce every component of life to a kind of process. And by the way, it's probably I'd say it's an unintended consequence of attempts at fairness. That attempts at fairness don't always work very well. Let me explain why. Because in order to be ostensibly fair, you have to treat everybody the same. But by treating everybody the same, you have to be blind to context. Also, by treating everybody the same, think of our education system. Some people are very good at academic shit, and they also make great employees. Some people are great at academic shit and make shit employees, and vice versa. There are people who are appalling academically who make both great and shit employees. There is probably some degree of correlation there, but it is absolutely not exact. Now, what you're doing is you're saying we're going to judge everybody and award starting salaries and jobs to people on the basis of the same criteria because it looks fair. But if those criteria aren't a reliable proxy measure for that person's potential value to society, all you've done is you've been very fair. You've been overly fair to people who happen, like me, who happen to quite like writing essays about the Peloponnesian War, and you're being massively unfair to people much more talented than me who just don't like writing essays about the Peloponnesian War. And it's very interesting working in advertising because it's a weird mixture of kind of chin-stroking Oxbridge types and people who just have some innate talent for doing it. Music industry is sort of the same. The Beatles couldn't read music. There are brilliant musicians who are also fantastic musicologists, but there are also people like the Beatles who basically couldn't read music and made it up as they went along. Yeah. They happened to do it very well. Now, what you're creating there is process fairness, but outcome inequality.
Yeah.
Now, there's a great guy, you ought to get him on the podcast, called Joseph Fishkin, who wrote a book called Bottlenecks. And if you apply the same criteria to everybody, you create an artificial bottleneck. He said, society as a whole, he's a legal scholar, UCLA, society as a whole should not be aiming for equality of opportunity, should be aiming for plurality of opportunity. We want to create a world in which lots of people with lots of different talents can bring those talents to bear and all be valuable in lots of different ways and make quite a lot of cash doing it. If you basically demand this business of fairness, fundamentally, one, it will almost be biased towards harm avoidance, I think, to an extent where you will end up harming society to protect the interests of one person. Mm-hmm. But secondly, this business of process fairness, outcome unfairness. So here's a parallel I always use. Sorry, but if you've heard it before. Let's imagine that we use not academic ability, but chess playing ability as a proxy for intelligence. My argument is it's a one-way proxy. If you're really good at chess, in some respect, you're probably quite clever. You may be utterly useless at everything else, but you are clever, in inverted commas. If you can play chess really well, I don't play chess for shit. However, you can't say the opposite, can you? You can't say that someone who's not good at chess is not clever. Mm-hmm. Now, I would argue that academic measures of ability, and in advertising, we used to get these people who, and actually banking used to have them, people who literally came through the trading floor, they came through the post room. There were people who are, actually, in some cases, high school dropouts who just had a particular facility for doing what it is that banks need to do. And we've created effectively this idea that so long as the process is fair, we've got nothing to worry about because the outcomes we don't have to care about. And that is Britain is an empirical, the whole thing that distinguishes the UK is that it's unlike France. It's a highly empirical, practical, common sense country where if it doesn't work in practice, you don't care what the theory says. And if it does work in practice, you don't care if it doesn't work in theory. That's a characteristic of British inventiveness, and yet we've been captured by these people who the whole thing about, I don't care if it works in practice, does it work in theory? And is the process objective? Because we've done this sort of thing, and we've created absolute disasters by applying the same criteria or the same process to conditions or problems which are contextually totally different. There are calls to violence and there are calls to violence. Any person on the street can go, if you say, I'm going to deck you, that can be both figurative or it can be literal as a threat. Yeah. But if you say, no, because I've seen it on the page, an example which happened, which terrified the life out of me, because my boss at the time was female, and there were a load of people, I think in Goldman Sachs or somewhere, who had to charter a private plane. And the joke was that the female member of the party should walk down the aisle of the plane going, would you like tea or coffee? Would you like tea or coffee? And it's a pathetic joke. It wasn't very funny. But the reason I said to my female boss that legal case terrified the life out of me was that she and I, who got on very well, it's not inconceivable that one of us might have made a similar joke, that there was absolutely no malice intended, but that it could then be used by a third party and misrepresented to, there are cases where people have brought complaints a year and a half after the incident occurred. Now, at the very least, you need to have a statute of limitations on this. Why? Because otherwise, employees can simply build up what you might call a list of potential grievances, hold them in reserve, keep their powder dry, and wait their moment to use them to get someone sacked or to get someone demoted or whatever. One of the things I think that these people are, the people who are process obsessed, unbelievably. I'll say this actually of left-wing people to an extent. I'm not exclusively right-wing. I'm a bit of a Gary fan. I'm also, if you're a Georgist, you're kind of confused anyway. But they're massively blind to the extent that once they have designed a process, two things can happen. Very similar to things like, I think, Goodhart's law. Once a metric becomes a target, it loses value as a metric. One, the process will have unintended consequences. Two, people will game the system. And there's something really, really weird about certain highly educated people where they think that quality of reasoning translates to quality of outcome. And if I can win the argument and the process is well designed, then the outcome will be wonderful. And if we invest a lot of intelligence in the process, we don't have anything to worry about because move on, nothing to see here.
Do you think that is Keir Starmer's approach to governing?
We certainly got the legal background. If we're being honest, I think the whole thing was fucked up by Derry Irving and Tony Blair, wasn't it, in 1997, when they fucked the whole judicial system around. Nothing, that was like the sort of going off the gold standard moment, I think, in terms of like weird judicial overreach, signing up to things with no democratic mandate to do so. You sign up to these legalistic mechanisms. I don't think that those would pass a citizens' assembly or a democratic support at all. Do you think? What did something go seriously fucked in 97? That's always the impression I've got, that they came in and they kind of got rid of the law lords and they created the Supreme Court. Since when you seem to have basically lawyers who I always totally admired and venerated seem to have become a bunch of activist wankers who are basically deciding the law, not actually enacting it.
Yeah, no, there's lots of examples of sort of post-Blair things being held up as being sort of, there was an argument a few months ago with Robert Jenrick and the Sentencing Council, and talking about attacking the independence of the judges because he had said something along the lines of the Sentencing Council have got something wrong, we should abolish the Sentencing Council, and the judges would kick off and say, well, actually, this is judicial independence, sentencing is for the judges, etc., etc. By saying you should abolish the Sentencing Council, you are attacking the independence of the judiciary. The Sentencing Council was set up in 2008, 2009.
Right.
It's not like we didn't have independent judges before the Sentencing Council existed.
Got it.
There's that sort of these principles, and freedom. Keir Starmer always falls back on. He always falls back on. when asked about freedom of speech in the UK has always had a freedom of speech, and that's not going anywhere anytime soon. But the UK has been a bastion of free speech before maybe 1985 with the Offensive Communications Act. Okay, when things started to slide, just relying on our history is not enough to negate the negative things that have happened yet, but also the things that have happened since 1997 do not. If we...
By the way, why don't we get some creative people in and say, how do we solve this problem without actually limiting free speech? And there's a perfectly simple way you can do it, by the way. One of the things I think you need to remove on social media is anonymity. There are no other... Well, no, that's not quite true. I'll tell you a very interesting story. I imagine in China something similar happened, but we don't know about it. Until the 18th century, where London reached a population of 1 million people, there were no circumstances where you could randomly insult people and not expect to suffer the consequences personally, either reputationally or indeed physically. And the reason was that even if you ran up, called someone a wanker and ran away, in a small town or in a small community, you'd bump into those people again. Now, you suddenly reach two particular situations, and we know this from Boswell's Life of Johnson, which is that Boswell points out that in London, on the riverboats in the 18th century, it was the custom for everybody on the boats to just shout random abuse at the people on the shore. Because the boat wasn't docking for another mile, and the city had a population of 1 million people. They weren't going to dive in and swim to the boat to hit you. And we know this because where all the other people were shouting fatso and wanker, Boswell reports that Dr. Johnson, in fact, recorded, he actually said, "Sir, your wife, under the pretense of running a bawdy house, is a receiver of stolen goods." And a particularly Johnsonian kind of, that belongs in Blackadder, actually, doesn't it? Okay. Now, what's interesting there is that it's highly unusual in the evolved environment for people to be able to... And now, obviously, there are things like anonymous letters with the advent of writing. I would argue that if you have the comments under a newspaper article and someone just writes tedious bullshit, the newspaper should just delete that comment because it adds nothing of value. I don't think it's acceptable for people to do this under the cloak of anonymity. I think that if you are to post in a public forum, your identity should be attached. Now, there's not an imposition on free speech. It is an imposition on basically people fucking around with technology in a way that we as humans are not evolutionarily prepared for. There was another one I said, which I also think in a weird way, which is, so the ancient Greeks had two concepts of free speech. You must get the Australian economist Nicholas Gruen on, by the way, because he's top on this. There's something like isegoria and something else. There's freedom of speech, which is you can say what you like, but there's also equivalence of your ability to speak. So in other words, now, the problem you have in social media is that most people on social media are perfectly sane, nice, decent people, particularly people under their own names. I've never had an anonymous account, I don't think. Nor would I wish to do so. I regard that as dubious. But there are certain people who just post endlessly on the same topic. Now, in a normal human environment, you couldn't get away with that. If you're the guy who every time he went to the pub, he complained about Brexit. Who's that guy Grayling? If you look at his Twitter feed, it's just literally, don't get me wrong, people who tweet a lot who are opposed to Brexit, but occasionally tweet about kittens, I'm totally happy to continue to follow them and continue to follow what they say. If literally everything you say in that forum, something which would never be allowed to you in any normal physical environment, and you simply go from place to place ranting about one thing. It's really fascinating if you write an article in favour of electric cars in the Telegraph or Times, because there are clearly people, there are only about 10 or 15 of them, who will literally seek out any article that's vaguely... At no point did I mention that they should be subsidised. At no point did I say that that gasoline cars should be discouraged. I merely said that electric cars are very, very good, and all the stuff about range anxiety is a load of bollocks, which it is. And you'll get these people, and literally they clearly seek out any article which mentions electric cars, and they just go into a kind of rant. And we can create mechanisms which say, there would be no problem with Twitter if people were limited to 10 tweets a day. They can say what the hell they like, but at least they give some thought to the quality of the tweet rather than just being some sort of deranged. And you look at these people. Now, I've been on Twitter since day. I'm Twitter user number 107,000. So I was really, really early. I've been there for ages. And I can't remember how many tweets I've made. It's probably in the, 10,000. I don't know, maybe it's 5,000, not sure. And then you occasionally come across people who've been on Twitter for like 4 years. And they've made like hundreds. There's a guy who had a real animus against Nassim Taleb. And Nassim added up the Twitter abuse he received from this man, and it would have made a hardback book. It was like 80,000 words of abuse. This literally, he devoted the contents of a hardback book in terms of quantity, not quality, to just abusing something that Nassim had said in one of his books. Now, I think it would be entirely desirable to everybody if the operators of those sites rationed. I don't think you can ration, subject matter. Although, my view is, if you do three serious tweets about the need for a land value tax, I think you owe people a dog falling off a skateboard. Just, because in pub conversation, that's what you do.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise you turn into the pub Marxist, don't you? And that was one of the reasons Marxism never took off in the UK, is it doesn't really mix with pub culture, does it?
No.
There's nothing, in British pub culture, if you sit there and go, well, you never guess what happened to me. Or that's the violence inherent in the system. Or, what about, what's that lovely phrase I always use? The inexorable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism. If you're the guy in the pub and you start talking about inexorable rifts in the interdependent process of social metabolism, basically people are going to avoid you.
Yeah.
And, I think there are ways in which freedom of actual speech can be preserved while actually avoiding some of the worst attributes of social media.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who are the people? You write an article on a Telegraph, boring shit, right? Well, at no point, there is no reason for the Telegraph not to remove that. If you say, I think this is entirely erroneous and the guy is an idiot because he failed to understand the laws of physics over the conservation of energy or whatever it might be, right? Totally legitimate. But abuse? Yeah, just random abuse. Why does the Telegraph leave that in? They don't have to. It's their space. And the only reason you can say is because they're probably optimizing for attention rather than optimizing for quality. In other words, they're optimizing for a short-term stupid metric of let's get these fuckers wound up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wealth tax is a great one with Telegraph readers. Apoplectic, insane. Inheritance tax.
Yeah.
Well, Adam Smith was in favour of inheritance tax. I mean, I'm in favour of it to a degree. I mean, in the sense that it should be levied on the recipient, probably not on the actual deceased, which would also encourage people to spread the money around a bit, wouldn't it?
Before we rush up, we'll try and wrap up fairly soon, but I want to talk a little bit about sort of current political policy debate. What's your
totally hate this government, by the way,
my question.
Which is weird because lots of people do.
Mm-hmm.
And they haven't engaged in some of the worst left-wing things like anti-Trump grandstanding, which, I'm totally mixed about the guy, really. There's a bit of me which goes, actually, anybody who isn't drawn from the standard sort of administsphere class that tends to govern us. If you ask from what my politics is, I belong to the garage east wing of the Conservative Party. The slightly wide, trying to make a bob, kind of, exactly people, David Davis, for example, or Norris, Grant Shapps, the wide, slightly nouveau riche division of the Conservative Party who are in favour of wealth creation rather than, I think there's also part of the Conservative Party which is all about wealth retention.
Yeah.
Yeah, I quite like, interestingly, who is it who comes out in favour of Lucy Letby? It's David Davis, and who was the one who came out as well? She's just migrated to Reform.
Nadine Dorries.
Yes. And there's a bit of me going, why is it that it should be like distinguished legal minds questioning this verdict? Why does it always fall to these? And the answer is, I think, the entrepreneurial mentality is fundamentally not a pack animal. I think there are certain valuable people in society, including genuine members of the working class, really posh people, okay, and nouveau riche entrepreneurs, all of whom possess that really valuable thing, which is fundamentally they're not. Their thinking is not principally constrained by social acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those people are, and I don't belong to any of those classes except perhaps, I'm certainly not genuinely posh, except perhaps by Welsh standards. But I think that that's a particularly valuable quality. I'd also say that there are totally authentic left-wing people entirely possessed of that. Maurice Glassman, who I met recently, there's an MP for Clitheroe who used to be a cop.
But the political system doesn't...
There are certain people on the left, and if you could actually have a political system, which actually probably in the early stages of the Thatcher administration you sort of had, okay, of independent thinking people from both the left and the right who weren't constrained by tribal loyalty or not getting disinvited from dinner parties. And that force is really strong, by the way. I mean, studying behavioural science, I always joke that all English men or British men would wear shorts almost all the time if it weren't for social pressure, just for comfort. And, I mean, women have that privilege. You can ventilate your nether parts if you want to. Men, no. And so there's a wonderful quote from George Washington where he says the same thing, that if you were forced to walk around your town wearing your wife's bonnet for the day, you would experience something basically not close to pain. It would be felt. I mean, social opprobrium or ostracism is, I think, experienced because we're a social species. It's genuinely experienced as pain, physical pain. I don't think it's a psychological, mental thing. I think it's absolutely felt. And so, having people who are a little bit free from that is, I think, it is essential, because otherwise you just end up with this kind of Overton window of economists and lawyers, designing for the process, not for the outcome, rinse and repeat.
Mm. To wrap up, quite specific question, but it's very topical at the moment. What's your take on the tube strikes? Are you standing with the strikers?
It's a very funny story, which I think is true, by the way, and I would love someone to research it. Back in the 1980s and 90s, because I'm old, the tubes and the buses used to go on strike on the same day, so you'd have a transport strike. And what I heard was that the tube drivers were very annoyed because when there were no buses on the road, everybody could drive in really easily, and it didn't create that much disruption. So sometime in the early 90s, the tube drivers reached an arrangement with the bus drivers that they wouldn't both strike simultaneously because it made them look bad. Okay. Now, if that is true, I think it's an absolutely wonderful finding, because I'm a very keen car driver. I came in today by train. Weirdly, I got a taxi very easily. They don't have quite the same power unless they strike for a week at a time because of flexible work with some people. It does place an intolerable burden on essential workers who tend to be less well paid, who have to be in a particular place. So it's a slightly weird working class movement, which I think disproportionately affects people with proper jobs, not people like me who can, as I did this morning, sit on Zoom all day talking to 400 people on a stream. And it is. Now, what is the grievance? Is it purely about pay? Is it about working conditions? I haven't investigated it. I had to say it took me by surprise on Sunday, because I only watch YouTube now. I don't generally watch linear television. So I'd completely failed to hear about this thing at all, probably because I was watching a 3-hour documentary on traction engines.
Well, that sounds great.
Which is, with the true happiness.
It's about pay and specifically hours. They want a 32-hour working week because their shift patterns. So it's working conditions more than pay. But it is, I think, both.
What does this cost net? Because there are statistics about how well-paid tube drivers are. I have got a very mischievous solution, which is, of course, you don't need tube drivers, because everybody who lived in London would be happy to volunteer to take a week's holiday just to drive a tube train for a week, because it'd be an absolute blast.
Where do I sign up?
In Dungeness, there's a steam railway, and there are volunteers who drive the little red trains. I think some of them are paid because it is a scheduled service, but you can pay money to drive the steam train for a day. Well, why on earth? I mean, there may be some safety considerations, but I mean, it's all health and safety gone mad, isn't it? Okay. There may be some safety and training considerations, but most people would pay to drive a tube train for a week. It would be an absolute blast. I'd love it.
Yeah.
However, that is a mischievous suggestion, which is not meant to be taken seriously. It's merely a mischievous reframing. I am probably sympathetic to the idea of a reduction in the working week in general. I don't think it's complicated. What it would mean is that people who needed the money more than leisure would be able to earn significant overtime. People who prefer... I don't think we always go, oh, look, we're free because it's a free market. Okay? No, we're not free because we're constrained by social norms. And at present, the social norm is that people who work 5 days a week. And if you go to your employer and say, I'd like to work 4 days a week, you immediately put a big sign above your head that says, lazy guy. Mm. But I think the ability to actually have, to determine your preference between leisure, labour, capital, money, all those things, fundamentally, you cannot have freedom without inequality, by the way, because people have wildly different preferences and priorities. And if you try and aim for equality of outcome, the only way you can do that is by completely suppressing individualism. Yeah, I'm actually quite rich and vulgar, and I effectively have the mentality of an Euro riche people. But those people who kind of live in the Welsh borders and sell joss sticks, kind of admire them. Yeah, it's in other words, we all have these trade-offs we have to make. It is a monstrous thing to try and impose on people very strong ideas about how you should live your life. And I think there is a significant number of people, including, by the way, I think a lot of people retire early who would actually much prefer to go part-time.
Yeah.
And that's actually a cost to the state in a way, isn't it? Because now there's a particular legal thing which I came across because I now work 2 days a week and do independent stuff. To be honest, the only way to make any money nowadays is to have more than one income source. Because if the only way you can make money now is to have people paying you who don't care how much other people are paying you. As soon as someone is the only person paying you, their natural instinct is to reduce that amount. Tragic discovery, but true. However, what I'd say is that I noticed that when I went down to 2 days a week, now I worked for over 34 years, if they then make me redundant, I'm not saying they're planning to do that, although I'm only one misgendering of someone's dog away from being fired, I guess. If they decide to do that, I mean, that, by the way, is an interesting effect of this intrusion of the legalistic into the workplace, which is no one feels secure anymore. And one of the biggest predictors of performance in the workplace is a sense of security in your team. These people have got my back. So long as we all hang together as a gang, we're all safe here. And that's been completely eroded so that everybody has a sense of precariousness. But if I go down to 2 days a week and then somebody decide to fire me, they only have to pay me 40% of the redundancy that they would previously have to pay me. There is no factoring in of the fact that I did 30-something years at 5 days a week, 4.5 latterly, actually, and then I've done 1 year at 2 days a week. Their liability to pay me redundancy money is entirely down to the 2 days a week I've been doing for the last 6% or 1% of my employment. Now, that strikes me as something that's slightly dubious, which is discouraging people from flexing it. I, broadly speaking, as a Georgist, I massively favour flexible working where possible because the freedom economists always obsess about money because they assume that all other choices are made freely in pursuit of the maximisation of your own expected utility. But actually, there are other currencies you can reward people with. And I always say there's money, there's free time, there's free where, and there's free when. So I would particularly value a job which allowed me to work flexible times. There are a lot of people, for me that would be an indulgence, but there are a lot of people with caring commitments who are looking after children, who are looking after elderly relatives, for whom they're perfectly capable of contributing massively to the workforce, but not under the rather stringent conditions that are currently being demanded of most jobs. One of the weird things is what is your opinion of 0 hours contracts? because I don't like them because I think they can be abused. And, I think there are employers who grotesquely abuse them. However, if you research people on 0 hours contracts, the majority of those people really, really like them. Because I think there are a lot of people who like working, want to work, but simply because of other life circumstances, they can't say, I will be at this location between 9 and 5 days a week without fail. But they're perfectly capable of contributing valuable work. I mean, I would love to see call centre work slightly better paid, because I think it's actually much more important than the people who employ call centre staff realise. And I'd love to see it being a source of flexible work, including for people who are semi-retired, because you can do it anywhere and you can do it at any time. There aren't that, taxi driving is one of the few. Taxi driving is one of the few, and you can work as hard or as little as you want according to how you feel. Yeah. An awful lot of our practices. Henry Ford, ironically, was the guy who created the two-day weekend. Not exclusively. It's a bit more complicated than that. I've got to caveat that a bit. But part of his motivation was he realized that Americans with a 2-day weekend would find it worthwhile to buy a car. I would love to do an experiment in one American state where they got 4 weeks paid vacation rather than 2. My contention is that if Americans had more leisure time, it would benefit the economy rather than hurting it, because they'd spend correspondingly more on leisure activities, which generally are the money spent locally, and it creates quite a lot of employment, rather than importing something from Shein for the 47th time that week.
Yeah.
So, we have one of the weirdest things about economics, to someone who works in advertising, is there is no discussion in economics about quality of consumption apart from taxing booze and fags. Pigovian taxes. Because the assumption is that every individual is optimizing for their own expected utility based on perfect information and perfect trust. Yeah, fucking right. Yeah, I mean, like, those conditions exist everywhere, don't they? Yeah, okay. So everybody's optimizing, and it also makes the assumption that the aggregate of individual optimization of utility leads to collective optimization of utility. And as someone who's worked in advertising, where my focus is entirely on the field of consumption, not production, I can see, it's blindingly obvious to me, that there are ways in which people can spend their money which is highly socially beneficial with massive positive externalities and hidden benefits. And there are ways in which people can spend their money buying a buy-to-let house, which are effectively predatory. And yet economics, for reasons I think of mathematical expediency, insists on treating all consumption as being equally valuable. Hey, I mean, just go out and look. Yeah, I'm not in favour of wealth taxes massively, but if you see some of the shit, don't get me wrong, I'm quite rich and I spend some money on some pretty fucking stupid shit, right? But seriously, if you look at the really rich and you see the bullshit they spend their money on, okay, now even I, as someone who worked in advertising, go, for fuck's sake, right? Okay, there are people who are poor, they're underpaid. I think a lot of people who do really hard. I want to live in a world where my postman has a jet ski. That's my kind of, world. And if in order for my postman to I don't know whether my postman wants a jet ski. Obviously, I would ask you. But I want generally most people to have a nice little amount of discretionary income and a reasonable pot of savings, because there is an inflection point in earnings where effectively your earnings go up and up and up, but your non-discretionary property, housing, etc., takes more and more of it. Tax takes more and more of it. But you do hit an inflection point where you go, I can actually decide what to do with my money now. And I'd like everybody in society to reach that point, because it was when I earned, well, I'm not going to mention the sum, but I just went to a particular threshold. I went, everything's different now. When my friends say, do you want to go out for a curry? I'm answering the question, do I want a curry? Not, can I afford to have a curry? Mm-hmm. And I think in a civilized society, we should aspire to that. And if the price of having that is that some weird Chinese investor can't buy a bloody flat in, Docklands for, £3 million and leave it empty because we've taxed the shit out of him, well, fine. And I'll tell you why, because if you think about it, I've never understood this. If you're Coca-Cola, if you're Unilever, if you're Ford, if you're Hyundai, if you're any of those brands that advertise, those people, all of those businesses would be massively the beneficiaries of wealth redistribution. away from people who save money towards people who spend it. I mean, if you think about it, okay, there are large categories of consumption where very wealthy people consume no more than ordinary people. Jeff Bezos spends less on shampoo than I do because he's fucking bald. Now, what I'm saying is that it would be undoubtedly to the benefit of Coca-Cola and McDonald's and everybody else if we actually gave more disposable income to lots and lots of quite poor people and gave less absolutely pointless investment income to a few very, very rich people who don't need the money anyway. So one of the questions I'm going to ask, independent of my own opinions on the matter, is why do those companies never come out in favour of greater, in other words, lower income taxes on the poor, slightly higher wealth taxes on the rich? I mean, that, you could only have got the Ford Motor Company off the ground. Before the Ford Motor Company, you could only get that off the ground effectively partly by lowering the price dramatically, but also because you were operating in a country where there was a large number of people who had enough discretionary wealth to go, I'll get one of those Model T things. That's how those things exist. There are also huge categories of consumption which are totally egalitarian. I mean, in other words, unless you want to have a jewel-covered mobile phone, someone on median income can own the same phone as someone who's a billionaire. Same goes for PlayStation games, same goes for Netflix, same goes for most content, unless there's some secret like billionaire Netflix, which is but I've never come across that. A lot of things are totally egalitarian, and the natural thing that the market wants to happen there is for everybody to have a bit of them, because my Netflix is better if more people can afford Netflix.
Yeah.
Fair? You agree with it? Okay. So what I'm saying is that quality of consumption matters, and we should not put VAT on pubs. We shouldn't put VAT on Netflix. Things where my consumption of something adds to the enjoyment of someone else, should be not taxed at all. Now, you sometimes get into this business. If you come across a guy called Lord Layard, he was obsessed with the idea that inequality causes misery.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very difficult to determine the different externalities of different forms of consumption. Generally, if you buy an electric car or if you buy a new car, I can reframe that as an act of philanthropy, because it means that in 3 years' time, someone considerably poorer than you has a really good car but only pays a third as much for it. You've effectively donated a car, albeit with 3 years' use, to someone who's less well off than you are. So I would make the case that actually tax breaks for certain purchases of that kind make total sense from an economic perspective. You are actually a philanthropist if you buy a car from new. But then it does get complicated, because Lord Layard would say that when people have a better car than someone else, status envy causes somebody else to be miserable. I deduced that Lord Layard isn't really a car guy, because actually, right, I don't know. You're Londoners. You probably get around on some Lime bike or something, do you?
Not particularly. I do have a car, but I'm not a car guy.
If you're a car person, you're actually delighted if your neighbour gets a Ferrari, because you can go out and talk shit about torque vectoring and active air suspension or whatever it is. So it's not as common. Layard's idea of what we envy and what we don't envy, and the sort of invidious comparison, I think is partly accurate and partly fair. I think we get areas where expectations, like of how beautiful the interiors of people's homes are, have become oppressive. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That actually the norm in terms of how neat and beautiful and well decorated your home has to be, I think is oppressive to people who just aren't that bothered by that shit.
Yeah, the Pinterest phenomenon.
And actually the Airbnb, I think, has contributed to it as well. I mean, when I was a kid, you'd rent a house and basically there'd be a broken armchair and stuff like that. And my father always loved that stuff, because he felt I didn't have to worry about the goddamn house. I can just make myself at home. And now there's got to be like a 9-foot diameter clock on the kitchen wall for no readily apparent reason, and a stupid sign saying "Live, Laugh, Love." And then you've got to pay Farrow and Ball to paint the walls a particularly weird colour.
Yeah.
And those are the things that bother me, not cars.
Mm-hmm. Just to, because we are over time now, but just the last question, and it's a relatively quick fire one, and I'm going to impose the restriction that you can't answer land value tax to this, because I'm pretty sure that would be your first answer.
Well, let me just say,
Go on.
The default answer to all these questions is land value tax,
yes.
Henry George, progress and poverty. But what I'm giving you in the future is the second best answer for the question.
Yeah, sure. So what if you were Keir Starmer or Rachel Reeves? what would be top of your policy wish list that you would deliver?
Very simple, actually. After the land value. By the way, I'm not that fanatic. Some form of experimentations with citizens' assemblies, local democracy, localisation. We're far too centralised because context in any decision, context matters.
That's quite Hayekian.
And absolutely. And therefore, I believe in the Hayekian sense of devolving decision-making to the people who experience its consequences. And I would ban speed cameras, and I'd rebrand the Conservative Party from the Conservative and Unionist Party to the Conservative and Motorist Party. Think about this, right? Most Londoners, most politicians who get around on some, the expense of the state, have no clue how the ordinary populace actually get around. Most people identify as motorists. And this would be an unbelievable brand grab. Because you just say, we're going to get rid of speed cameras, we're going to get rid of potholes. By the way, you would also be incredibly generous with your provision to cyclists, but you'd spend a load of money on building roads. And the reason you spend a load of money on building roads is that when you build a road, you can build a house next to it without being a NIMBY. If you won't build roads, you have to build houses next to other fucking houses. And then people go, I don't want a house next to my house. If you build a road, you can create a community. And by the way, the value of the land... Oh, sorry. I didn't go into land value capture. Whoop, okay. Just a minute, isn't it? You've got to speak for 60 seconds without interruption, hesitation, and without mentioning the land value tax. But we need to introduce Gary Stevenson to that, but that's nothing. You can pay for the road with the value captured by basically granting planning permission. And I would do this at the local authority level as a way of local authorities raising money. But I think that democracy has fundamentally failed partly because it's too centralized. If you look at local politics, now I may be wrong here, but I have friends who work in local government. It's not very politically polarized. It's not very ideological. They're not trying to win an argument. They're trying to solve a problem. And actually the thing that always upsets me is I'd like to live in a world where being in local government was more prestigious than being in national government. Because, and to be honest, will I ever do this? Could I sit through a Sevenoaks Council meeting for... No, probably not. I do watch them on YouTube occasionally. There was too much, in my opinion, there was a bit too much about Swanley Leisure Centre, not enough about the real issues like why doesn't Sevenoaks have a Taco Bell? But anyway, I'll ignore that for the moment. We really need... Seriously, inexpensive food, reasonably healthy. Yeah. What's the problem? But I think, I genuinely feel if I went into national government, I would get absolutely nowhere and be thwarted by a load of lawyers. And actually, if I went into local government, I can make a difference. And by the way, the first thing I would do as I don't want to be world king. I want to be Kent king. Right. There has to be a better way of repairing potholes. Just as I said, there has to be a better way of building houses. Look, it's 2025. We can manufacture Teslas at the rate of one every 15 seconds, and yet a house involves, literally, an episode of Grand Designs should be, put it there, thanks, in my opinion. Okay? Now, as Kent King, I would also instigate massive prizes for ingenuity. A bit like the Longitude Prize. So I go, okay, there's 5 million quid. If you can come up with a really good idea that basically means you can fix a pothole. If you could come up with an idea where the local residents could fix their own potholes and you'd pay them to do it, come up with some new mechanism like that. Because my view is that all this procedural bullshit, legalistic bullshit, health and safety, and I'll leave health and safety out of it. I don't want people to get hurt or lose their arms and things like that. But all this procedural bullshit you don't only pay the cost in terms of time and effort, and you don't only pay the cost in terms of people not doing things they would otherwise do because the friction's too great. You pay a massive cost in terms of innovation. Because if you have existing legislation about how to repair a pothole, almost any good new idea about how to repair a pothole will fall foul of some part of that procedural bullshit, which was written before you had the idea. It's rather like the Civil Aviation Authority and drones. I'd be pretty keen on getting a good drone economy going.
That feels like the perfect place to end it.
Well, no. Two more questions where I have to avoid mentioning land value.
No.
That's it. That's it. Okay.
That's it. That's it. So I think we will end it there. Thank you for your time. We'll have to get Gary Stevenson to introduce him to the land value tax and planning reform. Rory, thank you very much.
Absolute joy. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you too for watching. Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, on YouTube and on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Thanks so much for taking the time. But until next time, we'll see you then.